Welcome to HomeWord. I'm Jim Burns, and today we're talking about one of the most important subjects we can talk about. It's called nurturing your child's heart, mind, and soul, and my guest is George Barna, and I am so happy to have him on our podcast today. He's written a great book called Raising Spiritual Champions. I actually read it this week, and I love it. And by the way, this is his 60th book. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Many of us had trouble writing our, papers in college or even in high school, and this is his 60th book. Wow. George has been named by numerous media outlets as one of the nation's most influential leaders. He graduated from Boston College, Rutgers University, and Dallas Baptist University is where he got his doctorate. George is the director of research at the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University, a great school, by the way, among other leadership positions that he's involved in around the country. He and his wife, Nancy, have 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren. And here's something that I did not know about George. We talked about it before the podcast. He and Nancy were married at the iconic Princeton University Chapel in 1978. It's iconic. I mean it. So when I was in grad school, I would go to that chapel sometimes if I just wanted to feel close to God. And honestly, I would sit there. I'd sit in the back. It's massive. And I would just be inspired. And then I realized he got married there. So he was must be really close to God. Many people say that George is often described as America's most quoted Christian leader, and I quote him all the time. And so it's just a pleasure to have you on the podcast, George. It's really an honor to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
It's just good to be with you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Very fun. On the HomeWord YouTube channel, they can see your guitars in the back. So not only are you the research, guru of Christianity, you also play a mean bass, I'm told.
As long as I'm not a mean bassist, that's okay. Yeah.
That's a good point. Hey, talking about nurturing your child's heart, mind, and soul. And again, you wrote this great book called Raising Spiritual Champions. I read it today. I'm kind of showing people the book. You reveal some amazing research about adults under 40 years of age. So your research says that 2 out of 3, or 67%, say that these people are still trying to identify the meaning and purpose of their life. 22% claimed that life is sacred, only 22%. 54% admit that they often feel anxious and depressed and unsafe. So those are your words. What does that say about this next generation of young adults? And then also, how does that relate to these same people raising spiritual champions as they become parents?
Yeah, the way that I've come to filter all the research and what's going on in ministry is by looking at worldview, because everybody has a worldview. All of the choices that we make are based on our worldview. And so as we look at the worldview of today's parenting generations, what we find is only 2% of them have a biblical worldview. Why does that matter? Because you can't give what you don't have. What you do is you reproduce who you are. And so what we have are a national group or segment of parents who are basically going to reproduce themselves, which means that we'll have a little bit of God, but we'll have a little bit of many other spiritual traditions as well, equally represented in most cases as any kind of Christian beliefs or traditions or spiritual focus. So it's not a positive picture for the future. As we look at the trend lines in terms of worldview, what we see is that when I started measuring these things, Chuck Colson and I started looking at this back in the early 90s. And it led to him writing his book, How Now Shall We Live? And of course, I've done a lot of work on that consistently over the last 30 plus years. And what we find is that very slowly but consistently, the proportion of Americans who have a biblical worldview, which means simply that your core beliefs on which you make all your life decisions are coming from the Bible. They're based on biblical principles, as opposed to based on Marxist principles, postmodern principles, secular humanist principles, Eastern mystical principles, all the other options. You're turning to the Bible for your primary moral and spiritual guidance. Well, that number is consistently decreased. And so it's going to take a very intentional and consistent approach to turn that around. If we just keep doing what we've been doing, which is what we seem to keep doing, really what that means is that the Christian church is on the way out the door. I wrote a piece recently that was picked up by a lot of media where I talked about Christian invisibility. And the
Mm.
concept behind that was I was looking at people's circles of influence. Who influences them and who do they influence? And what I found is that increasingly there are no Christians involved in most circles of influence in America. What we tend to do is we gather together, we huddle together, and we circle our wagons and we talk to each
Oh,
other. We've got our own echo chamber and we cheer each other on,
yeah.
but we're not influencing the culture. The culture is influencing the church more than the church is influencing the culture.
Yeah, and that's so important, and, guys like you and me, I mean, we might be getting older, but we've gotta change that. At HomeWord, we're making a major move toward next generation parents, and, as we do that, we have to deliver content differently, we have to talk about how we reach them differently, similar topics, interestingly enough, but again, I love what you said. Now I'm gonna take you back about 20 years, okay? We've been friends for a long time. About 20 years ago, I was talking with you one time, and you had mentioned that you had kind of had this aha because you were doing research then on biblical worldview, raising children, and your aha was that how important it was for parents to be the dominant discipler. And again, I'm just going, wow, George Barna is now singing our song. I mean, that's amazing. But talk about the aha because I've read most of your books, and it seems to me now it continues to be even a more major force than it was even when you got started.
Well, it all comes back to what I was saying about worldview. Worldview is the center of everything.
Yeah,
It's where you
yeah,
decide whether or not you're going to follow Jesus, whether or not you're going to
yeah,
believe the Bible, whether or not you're going to live your life as a Christian. All of
yeah.
that and more flows out of your worldview. Everybody has a worldview. What I began to realize 25 years ago or so was that a person's worldview begins forming at 15 to 18 months of age and is pretty much fully
Mhm.
formed by the age of 13. Now, since then, I've been able to do a lot more research on all of this, including a longitudinal study where we track people over a few decades. And what we discovered is
Mhm.
that most people die with the same worldview they had at the age of 13. It
Oh,
doesn't
interesting.
change much. Now, it does change in some people's lives. There is hope if somebody doesn't have a biblical
Yeah,
worldview. Can
right.
it? Can it change?
Well, that was me. I
Yeah,
wasn't
me
raised in the
neither.
church. At
Yeah,
13, I wasn't a Christian. So I became a Christian at 16. So, there
yeah.
is hope.
And I didn't become one until 24. So, yeah, it
Yeah,
can be done, but it's unusual. Typically, it takes a crisis in a person's life
yeah,
because that's what
yeah.
challenges you to rethink everything that you'd thought before. Do I understand this? Am I doing that right? Am I pointing myself in the
Mhm.
right direction? It takes a crisis
So
to kind
interesting.
of jog us loose from what we've already bought into and no longer
Yeah.
think about. It's just part of our identity. Uh,
Now, what's fascinating is yeah, part of our identity. Did you
no,
wanna go
no,
on or
I'll talk
okay,
forever if you
quick
don't cut me
question then.
off. Yes.
No, you're doing great. At age 13, so I read that in your book, I circled it because I wrote a book a few years ago called Doing Life with Your Adult Children, Keep Your Mouth Shut and the Welcome Mat Out, which they don't need to read the book. That's just what you do, keep your mouth shut and welcome that out. You've got 3 adult children. But what was I would say the number one thing that people write to me about is my kids strayed. We raised our kids in the church. They were in children's ministry. They were in youth ministry. And at 13, they were, you know, followers of Christ, excited about camp, all this, but they left the church after high school. And it shocked this generation of parents that were kind of doing a lot of the things that you write about in your books or I write about in my books. What do you say to that parent who, they have this foundation? Are the kids going to come back? These adult kids? What are you seeing in that
Yeah, we
place?
don't see them come back very often
Yeah.
unless there's
Mm,
somebody who that individual really trusts and they have
mhm,
a strong relationship with them where they get to spend a lot of time together. And it's through that
mhm.
kind of a relationship then that you can start chipping away and saying, oh, you don't even challenge them. You just ask them questions. It's a Socratic approach. Wow, I thought
Yeah.
it was really interesting. I saw you do that. What made you do that? Explain that to me.
Mhm.
And just
Right.
get them
Right.
talking about their choices and
Right.
eventually getting down to the point where they're having to identify what's the foundation of my choice? What's the truth
Right.
on which that action was based. And then you get to talk
Yeah.
about that truth and that action, those choices, without having to tell them, well, that was stupid. You were wrong. Why didn't you turn to the Bible? Because
Yeah.
then it's causing them to reflect on something that normally they wouldn't reflect on. We're
Right.
a reactive nation. We're not a nation of
Yeah, we are.
thinkers. We don't like to reflect
Yeah.
on anything. Number one, it takes time. Number two, sometimes it's painful. Number three, nobody else is doing it. And so, we
Right.
just respond in the moment, live in the moment. It's all about being in the moment and
Right.
reacting as best you can based on what your foundation is. It takes that
Right.
kind of a trust based, time
Right.
soaked relationship to cause somebody to
Yeah.
go back and rethink it. So, can a person
Yeah. No,
change? Yes, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to happen
no, it
overnight.
isn't. No, no. I get that. In fact, if it happens overnight, it's like there may be something wrong with it. They actually need to kinda probably come back into it a little slower. I was at Forest Home last week. It's a Christian conference center in California, you'd know it. And, I was talking with a young person who said they had walked from the church. They have little kids now, and that was a motivator because 'cause they'd had a good experience in church. They got mad at what the church was about, and they got mad at the political stuff, and, kinda everybody gets put in with weird politics and weird, things. And they said, but what they missed was community. And so they went to an Alpha. Alpha is a great, ministry out of England, which is here, and our church actually has an Alpha. And they said they were able to talk through things, and they found community with that in that group. And they were drawn back not just because of words, but they're also drawn back because of community. They said the greatest people we knew were Christians when we were growing up, and we walked away from really normal Christians instead of some of the wackadoos that they got all mad at. And I thought that was an interesting testimony. I want to go back to biblical worldview because, again, reading your book on raising spiritual champions, everybody should read the book again just to get a basic understanding of biblical worldview. And you said 2%. That's just remarkable. But when you start to teach your kids about a biblical worldview, obviously you have to live it. But what do you do practically to develop a biblical worldview in a family? What are you seeing that's working in your research and in your
Yeah,
experience?
there are several things that are critical. Maybe the most important of those is that you've got to be consistent. One of the most shocking things that came out of the research for the book, we did 7 new research projects that the book is based on.
Wow.
And one of
Wow.
those, we talked with kids 8 to 12 years old across the country, talked with them about a lot of things. But the thing that jumped out and slapped me in the face was when kids told us they don't trust their parents. And we said, well, wait a minute. I mean, you're living with them. Do you think they love you? Yeah, of course they love me. Then why don't you trust them? And in essence, what they told us was because I'm a kid, I'm trying to figure out who I am, who I want to be, how I'm going to get there, what my life is going to be like, what I need to learn, who I need to hang out with,
Mm.
all these important things. And so I asked my parents about these things and I listened to their answers, but then I watched their life. And what I see is that they're doing things that are in opposition to what they told me I should be doing.
Mm.
I said,
I
okay,
see.
well, so what? And they said, well, the way I interpret it is they're as confused about life as I am. So they don't have the answers
Right.
either. So I've got to
Right.
go
Right.
someplace that has the answers. And I said,
Yeah.
so what does that look like for you? And it confirms something we've been finding in our research now for the last 20 years, which is that the primary worldview developer of children in America are the media. And so
Fascinating.
we talked about that. I said, well, why do you go to the media? And they said, well, they always know the answer and they stick with it. Their way of saying they're consistent. When they
Mm.
say something, then you see them do something that's in parallel with what they've taught. And I was thinking about that. It's so hard to be a parent because you're on display 24/7, 7 days a week, every week of the year, for as long as the kid's in the house. And with the media, it's so much easier. You have a television program. If I'm a writer for a television program, I only have to write 24 minutes of material. I only have to be
Yeah.
consistent for 24 minutes. That's not that hard.
Right.
If I
Right.
do a
Right.
movie, they give me 2 years to come up with 90 minutes of material. Can I be consistent under those conditions? Sure can. If I write a
Yeah.
pop song that hits the top of the charts, 4 minutes, baby. That's all I got to fill, and half of
That's
that's
right. That's right.
music, so my lyrics aren't
Yeah.
anything, so it's so much easier through the media to be consistent. And that's one of the major reasons why the media are the ones that are raising our children.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because I was talking with some people last night. I was speaking at an event and I was saying to them about media. I was saying you can use media to teach them, like saying, well, this isn't what we believe. This is what we believe. But you can use they're influenced by media. So, here's what the media says, but you can't always trust we have to teach our kids to not trust the media. Because it's amazing to me that my kids they would, and it might be their teacher, it might be something it would be culture, just culture, not just media, but culture. And they'd go, well, that's what they say. And how do you know they're right? And they go, well, I saw it. It was on my iPhone. It was, whatever. And I'm going, why would you think that has to be right? Because they can spend 24 minutes, but they may not be
Yeah.
right. And so I think we have to teach our kids, whose voice are you going to listen to? I have a new book coming out in next month, and I've never thought I was going to write another book for kids, and it's probably my last book for students, and it's on sexual integrity. And one of my chapters is on, are you going to listen to the culture voice, on say things like gender, or are you going to listen to authority, the Bible? And because what's fascinating is God is not the great killjoy when it comes to that, but we listen to these cultural voices as if they are the truth when we've had the truth. People who live by a biblical worldview for all these years, they've made good choices. And it's not like God's some angry God when it comes to sex. He created sex and sexuality. He created pleasure. He created all this stuff in the context of marriage. But it's fascinating to me because this generation of kids and sometimes their parents are more influenced, like you say, by the culture. And so I think part of our job is teaching them to learn to discern, to become responsible thinkers, so that they can have a biblical worldview.
One of the things that we did with our girls when they were growing up, we built a movie room in our house.
Yeah.
10 foot by 10 foot screen, the whole thing.
Oh,
And we put in the director's chairs, the big movie chairs, cough,
so cool. I love
yeah.
those.
And the idea was, girls, invite your friends over, watch movies here, because we want to know who their friends were. We wanted to keep an eye on what movies they were watching. And the other thing that we
So good.
did was we sat in with them a bunch. We said, oh, I haven't seen this movie. I'd love to see this. And we'd watch it. Now, here's maybe where we
Yeah.
went a bit astray. I had a habit of stopping a movie in the middle and saying, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, did you hear what they
Sure.
just said? What do you think of that?
Yeah.
Trying to get a dialogue going. And at first, they go for it. But after a while, it's like, can we get through the movie, please? And after like 3 years of this,
Right.
I noticed that our girls weren't inviting their friends over anymore. I said, well, what happened with the movie room? They said, Dad, you ruined movies for us. We can't invite them over.
Exactly.
But they got the point. They got the point. And so,
Yeah.
and
Your questions are still in their
yeah,
mind too.
yeah.
In a
And they
good
were
way.
embarrassed
Yeah.
when they would say, oh, well, I did see
Right.
that movie with
Right.
my friends. I know I shouldn't have. Well, how do you know that?
Yeah.
And then we go through it. So, yeah, but
No, it's really good. I mean, and it's teaching them to learn to discern. I had that experience. You're doing a lot of work in Arizona, and we were at my daughter Heidi, who's now in her 30s, but she was 10, and she was the Junior Olympics champion. So she was in the big arena there, and she was practicing like crazy in gymnastics. So I took the two kids to a teen movie. So she was 10, that would put them at 12 and 14, and I didn't do any research on it, and it was gross. I mean, it wasn't like filthy; it was rated PG-13, but it was just
yeah.
gross. And I had two thoughts. One is my wife is going to kill me, and two, my kids are enjoying this movie way too much, and the humor was crazy, right? So afterwards, I take them out for ice cream, and I've practiced. I mean, I have like 6 questions. My kids still tease me about that. But I said, okay, so what did you think about that relationship? What do you think about this and that? They still tease me, but you know what? They still think about it. And now that they have kids, they're kind of more doing the kind of things that I was
Right.
doing
Yeah.
back then. But it's still, I mean, that was what, 24 years ago, and I'm still mocked for having that conversation.
But you know what? That's a
I'll be
badge
mocked.
of courage, man, because it means you did
Yeah.
your job. And
Yeah. Well, it was also trying to get Kathy when she heard what it was about. It was trying to get her to still like me. But yeah, it was. But parents need to do the badge of
Yeah,
courage thing, and we need to do it from not a negative thing. I love what Francis Schaeffer years ago, the great thinker, said. Every generation, we need to recommunicate the gospel. The gospel's the
right.
same, but we need to learn how to recommunicate the gospel. When it comes to raising spiritual champions, we don't have a chance if we don't help our kids understand how to look at the grid of being a Christ follower through a biblical worldview. So I'm converted. I mean, when I read your book, I went, oh, way to go, George. That's great. Hey, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. George Barna is with us today. You can tell I am so happy about that. We're talking about nurturing your child's heart, mind, and soul. His book is called Raising Spiritual Champions. Go out and get it. I just want you to all go out and get it. The information about George, the book, all his resources are in the show notes, and we'll come back in just a moment.
Hey, I'm Kelly Fellows. Did you know that HomeWord also has resources for parents and married couples? You can find all those resources at our website, homeword.com. Also, check out our YouTube channel, where we create 1-minute video vitamins to encourage parents and to resource couples. Check those all out at YouTube/HomeWord and also our website, homeword.com. Now let's get back to our podcast.
Welcome back. I am so happy you are listening to this podcast today or watching it on the HomeWord YouTube channel. You get to look at George Barna and my face. Well, actually, maybe you should just stick with the podcast and not watch the YouTube channel. But I always find, by the way, people write us and say that they're really enjoying the YouTube channel because they kind of see us, interacting. And so that's a cool thing to do. And I can't think of a better conversation than nurturing your child's heart, mind, and soul. Every person who's listening to this podcast wants to nurture their child's heart, mind, and soul. And Raising Spiritual Champions, the book, again, just, plug on this. And I don't have to. I'm not paid by this. I just want you to read it because it's going to help you nurture your child's heart, mind, and soul. And I appreciate you being on listening to the podcast. I so appreciate having George here. George, what do you say to the parent who is motivated to raise a spiritual champion, but they never had their own parents ever do that? I mean, in many ways, that would be you and me, because our parents weren't, doing that. But what do you say to them when they say, I don't even know where to start?
Yeah, there are two things I say. One is you can never go wrong if you can find a spiritual mentor, a coach, somebody who's going to come alongside you and you guys just hang out, you talk about life, you do life, you're living it together and you're growing through that. The second thing I say is, and remember with your kids, they don't know if you know something or not. Therefore, you only have to be about 10 seconds ahead of them and you'll be okay. And so if you want to be 10 seconds ahead of them, start with what I found statistically to be a phenomenal foundation for building your own biblical worldview. And that's this thing I talk about in the book called the 7 cornerstones of a biblical worldview.
My next question. Yeah, go with those. I don't know if we can get into all 7, but kind of give us an overview of what these cornerstones are, and then the people can go to the book.
I mean, it's Sunday School 101. I discovered it running through the statistics at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm sitting here trying to figure stuff out, and I found, wow, if you believe all 7 of these, not just believe it, but you live them, you own them, they're part of who you are, they're your identity, you have an 83% probability of developing a biblical worldview. This is in a culture where only 4% of all adults, only 2% of all current parents have a biblical worldview. 83% probability. You reject even one of those 7 beliefs as part of your lifestyle, it drops to a 2% probability. That's how important these are. I don't know if I've ever seen a correlation quite like that. So, I mean, it's just things about understanding that God exists and his very nature. It's things about, realizing that when we're born into sin. That's our natural inclination. It's not to be good people. Most Americans say, oh, people are good, basically good. No, they're not. The scriptures teach that. And I think the model of humanity shows that. Then talking about what do you do with that sin nature? How do you handle that? And so that's part of the 7 cornerstones. And then it talks about truth and some elements related to truth. It talks about elements related to success and purpose. These are very basic things. Every human being has to really come up with the answers to these things pretty early in life. And that's part of the challenge, is that we come up with those answers early Before
Right.
we know what we're
Yeah.
doing, we emulate people who are modeling a lifestyle that may be appealing to us, but it's not healthy for us, spiritually healthy.
Yeah.
And so
Oh,
we
so
get
so
into a
good.
rut, we get into bad practices. The seven cornerstones can snap us out of it if we buy into it.
Right, right. We're going to put those seven cornerstones on the show notes so you can see them. When I read those, George, what I thought about was that's the foundation for a biblical
Mhm.
worldview. And Jesus gave at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he gave an incredible illustration. Do you build your house on the rock or on the sand? The rain's going to come, so tough stuff's going to
Right.
happen. But if you build your house on those, all cornerstones, and I love that they're all cornerstones. I don't know how that works in the building industry, but those become the rock. And from there, then we move on to all the other things. I mean, it could be discipline, it could be getting your homework done, it could be so many different other things, but the cornerstones become that foundation. And what I'm finding is a lot of families do fail at that because they're trying to build their house on sand. And what you've just said, what you said so eloquently earlier, was that when it comes to culture and when it comes to all the things that they're being thrown out in media, that's kind of sand. Even, those people are articulate. You said that, but they also change their mind. I mean, if you look in past history when it comes to morals and values and things like that, there were some pretty people now who are quite liberal who weren't so liberal 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So they were shouting something different. And we're basing some information that's not really well researched. If you take living together, in 1975, you weren't married at the Princeton Chapel yet, but you were getting closer. If 75% of the people said that they would live with someone or they would not live with someone before instead of marriage. Today, that's the opposite. I just read that statistic. And I think that's really interesting research because the secular world, that's secular research, but they don't share that one.
Right.
And then it says if they do, then they have a greater chance of divorce, a greater chance of adultery. That makes sense. A greater chance of less sexual satisfaction. Again, we're not turning this into the Jim and George sex talk, but I'm just saying we can't believe everything that comes out with culture today.
Well,
But we can't be the angry Christians who are like just being mean-spirited to everybody either, because that's not going to work.
and that's why I think it's so helpful for Christians to be well versed, not just in the biblical worldview,
Yes.
but to know what the competing
Yeah.
worldviews are so that you can recognize them when they're coming at you. Because that's what's been happening in our cultures. We've switched from maybe a dominant secular humanism culture to a dominant postmodern culture. Now we're switching from a dominant postmodern culture to a dominant Marxist culture. And with each of those, they have different kinds of twists and nuances which become culturally appropriate, but they're not
Amazing.
biblically appropriate. But do we know that? Do we know why they're not biblically
No, so
appropriate?
good.
Can we speak to those issues? So this is part of the challenge to us as parents is to know
Yeah.
that our kids are being raised in the schools and in the media and, on their ball teams and elsewhere by Marxists, by postmodernists, by
Yeah.
secular humanists, by mystics, all these different things, animists and
Best.
whatnot. Can we speak to those issues with our kids, or do we just say, well, the Bible doesn't believe that, so we don't believe it? But why?
No,
I mean,
no. And that's not worked. That
no.
hasn't worked. We've tried
Yeah.
that, and that doesn't work. We actually need to help them to learn to critically think through that process. You're being a prophet here. I mean, you're really prophetic on this. I want to talk about research because you are, the research guru here. How do you measure something like spiritual growth and development? It seems like that's a hard way to measure because you can't just do it with your mind, because I can say something in my mind, but it hasn't translated to my heart. So how do you measure that?
Yeah, accountability is a key issue where you've got a close enough relationship with somebody that, first of all,
Mhm.
you give them the
Mm.
privilege of asking you tough questions anytime
Yeah, it's good. Yeah,
because you care about who you are spiritually. If you care, you open yourself up,
right.
make yourself vulnerable. That's important to
Very good.
do. Do it with someone you
Yeah,
trust, someone who's as mature or more mature spiritually than you, so that they
yeah,
can recognize things. They know the right questions to ask and they're not
yeah.
afraid about it. The other thing too is conversations with people, having those kind of conversations, and thinking about the conversation as, what did I say to that person? Why did I say that? How are they going to take that? And always thinking about, is that how Jesus would have discipled that person? Because
Mm,
if you have a biblical worldview, that's the thing. We do what we believe. That's why your worldview is so important. We think of it as just beliefs. No, worldview is actually beliefs and behavior. But the beliefs are important because you do what you believe. So you want to
mm,
think like Jesus so that you can act like Jesus. And
yeah,
if you've got that biblical worldview and therefore you're trying to act like Jesus, you're a disciple of Jesus. You want to live
yeah.
like him.
That's
And so at all times, as a discipler, who makes disciples? The only people that can make disciples are disciples. So we've got a huge
yeah,
responsibility,
so good.
but we've also got to be challenging ourselves to be thinking about, after I have that conversation with someone, how did I do? Did I represent Christ well? Did,
Yeah,
did I display biblical virtue in a practical sense, or will they go away confused or maybe turned off? So always looking at myself through that kind of lens of, am I representing Christ well?
that is so great. And again, we're out of time. Wow, did time fly by? Thank you for your great insight. Thank you for being all these years a man of integrity and standing with the biblical worldview and continuing to teach us how to live our lives to be effective, disciplers of our kids as well as just disciples. Thank you so much for who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks. We're all sinners. We're all imperfect. I'm learning. We're all trying to grow. I just want to honor Christ. And, you know,
Yeah. Well, you've continued to do that so well. I appreciate it so
thanks,
much.
Jim. Great to be with you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, honestly. George Barna, one of my honestly heroes. I just love and adore this man, and I've learned so much from reading. I tell people read one parenting book a year, read one marriage book a year, but read one George Barna book a year. You'd learn so much because he takes research and then he applies it to Christian values. You can see how good this has been. Hey, listen, right before we go, I want to talk a little bit about what George and I were talking about. I cannot agree more with George. But I want to talk just for a moment about discipleship and leadership beginning in the home. I think we made the mistake somewhere along the line that we thought it was going to be through children's ministry and youth ministry. You know that I have a youth ministry background. I love children's ministry. I speak at those events. But they aren't the people who should take the lead. We've got to take the lead. We have more hours with our kids. We have more influence and impact with our kids. And research again shows that, parents impact, even my parents who weren't in the church, they impacted me spiritually. George and I were talking about that. So I want you to leave this with three things. One is lead with integrity. The Bible says whoever walks in integrity walks securely. And I'm convinced that if you live with integrity, then you will have kids who will also feel secure because of your integrity. And that's a part of that biblical worldview we were talking about. Also, lead with margin. Look at, busy people are often broken people. Busy families are broken families sometimes. Busy marriages are mediocre at best. So lead with margin. Have enough margin in your family context and in your own life so that you can not make poor choices because of your busyness. Somebody once said to me, in fact, actually, I was supposed to be at the Princeton Chapel where he got married, and for graduation, I didn't stay because I wanted to get home and go back to youth ministry. And a friend of mine wrote a note and he said, if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. Missed you at the graduation. And, that was prophetic for me. I'm not going to be in the arms of another woman. I'm not going to embezzle money, but I'm going to be so busy doing quote unquote important things that I'm going to miss the most important. I have to ask myself the question, am I giving my family only my emotional scraps? We don't do well energizing our family spiritual life if we're giving our family emotional scraps. And then lastly, lead. Notice I say the word lead. That's what we do. We disciple our kids and we disciple our families by leading. Lead with the eternal perspective in mind. Okay. Be intentional about discipleship, but we're not leading just to get through Thursday, which we all do as parents. Oh, it's Thursday. We're done with it. Oh, we got to start again on Friday. But lead from the eternal perspective. And when you lead and parent with the eternal perspective, you're going to discipline differently. You're going to deal with media differently. You're going to deal with sexuality differently. You're going to deal with school differently. Because again, when you lead from the eternal perspective, you're bringing this world view to them. And they're not only seeing it in your life, but also you're putting energy into that. So anyway, just some thoughts right before we go. What a joy to have George on the podcast today. Amazing podcast coming up. So please don't not listen if you can. The beautiful thing about a podcast, you can listen to it at any time. And also, we've got our sister podcast with Paige Klingenpill, Embracing Your Season, Parenting the Littles and Understanding the Teens. And she is crushing it at all times. And I just really want to encourage you to take a listen to Paige if you haven't heard that yet. And I'm learning from Paige in beautiful ways. So until next time, I'm Jim Burns, and you are listening or watching HomeWord.